in the lobby of the United Nations building in New York City. Amidst the rush of modern diplomats and the high-stakes politics of the 21st century, there hangs a silent observer from a forgotten age. It is a copy of an ancient clay tablet, jagged and brown, covered in the wedge-shaped scratches of a language that went unspoken for 3,000 years. It is the Treaty of Kadesh, the world's first recorded peace treaty. It represents a promise of eternal brotherhood between two superpowers who once divided the known world between them. We know one of the signatories well, the Egyptians, the Golden Empire of the Nile. Their legacy is etched into the collective consciousness of humanity. We know their pharaohs, their pyramids, their gods, and their tombs. We gaze at the mask of Tutankhamun and feel a connection to their history. They are the celebrities of the ancient past, immortalized in stone and sand. But the other name on that tablet, the other superpower that was strong enough to force the mighty Ramses the Great to sue for peace. For millennia, they were nothing more than a ghost. They were the Hittites, and unlike Egypt, they did not fade gracefully into history books. They were violently erased. 3,000 years ago, the Hittites ruled the harsh, unforgiving highlands of modern-day Turkey. From their fortress city of Hattusa, they commanded an empire of iron and blood that rivaled Babylon and Egypt. They were the masters of the chariot, the architects of geopolitics, and the guardians of a legal system surprisingly fairer than our own ancient ancestors. They sacked Babylon, checked the ambition of the pharaohs, and worshipped 1,000 gods. And then, in the blink of an historical eye, they vanished. Their cities were burned to ash, their libraries were buried under the dust of the Anatolian steppe, and their very name was forgotten by the world. For centuries, historians believed they were a myth of biblical fiction with no basis in reality. But the ruins tell a different story. They tell the story of a civilization that rose from a curse, conquered the world with superior technology, and then collapsed into one of the greatest mysteries of the Bronze Age. This is not just the story of a lost empire. It is a warning. It is a story of how a civilization at the absolute peak of its military and political power can be swept away, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. To truly understand the Hittites, you must first understand the land that forged them. History usually tells us that great civilizations rise in cradles of civilization, gentle. Fertile valleys like the Nile in Egypt or the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia. In those places, the rivers flood on schedule, the soil is black and rich, and life, while hard, is predictable. The Hittites did not have that luxury. They were the children of the Anatolian plateau, the rugged heart of modern-day Turkey. This was a land of extremes. The winters were brutal and snowy, cutting off trade routes for months. The summers were scorching and dry. It was a landscape of jagged peaks and altitude steppes that demanded toughness just to survive. If Egypt was a garden, Anatolia was a fortress. And it was here, in this unforgiving terrain, that the Hittites decided to build their capital. But the story of their capital, Hattusa, begins with a warning. Around the year 1700 BC, long before the Hittite Empire rose to glory, the land was divided among warring tribes. A tribal king named Anita swept through the region, crushing his rivals one by one. When he reached the city of Hattusa, he didn't just conquer it, he annihilated it. He burned the city to the ground, sowed weeds over the ruins as a symbol of desolation, and inscribed a curse onto a clay tablet that has survived to this day. He wrote, "Whoever becomes king after me and resettles, may the storm god of heaven strike him down." For a century, the ruins lay silent, avoided by superstitious locals who feared the wrath of the gods. But then, a new leader emerged. He was a man of immense ambition who looked at the charred ruins and saw something else. He saw a location that was nearly impossible to attack into a deep valley surrounded by sheer cliffs and easily defensible passes. He ignored the curse, he ignored the history, he rebuilt the walls, taller and stronger than before. He took the name Hattusili, which literally means the man of Hattusa, and challenged the gods to stop him. The storm god did not strike him down. Instead, Hattusili transformed this cursed graveyard into the engine of a superpower. From this rocky fortress, the Hittites looked outward at the wealthy cities of the south and realized that if they could unfarm their way to riches, they would have to take them. The curse was broken, but the hunger for conquest had just begun. By 1595 BC, the Hittites had transformed from a mountain tribe into a military machine, but the world didn't respect them yet. To the sophisticated kings of the Middle East, The Hittites were just barbarians living in the hills. Then, a new king named Mursili decided to change the map of the world forever. He launched a military campaign that, on paper, looked suicidal. He didn't just attack his neighbors. He marched his army south, out of the mountains of Turkey, and kept going. He marched them 1,200 miles. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the distance from London to Rome or New York to Florida. In the Bronze Age, moving an army that far was a logistical nightmare. You had to feed them, water the horses, and fight off local warlords every step of the way. But Mursili drove them relentlessly toward a specific target. He was hunting big game. He was heading for the jewel of the ancient world, Babylon. Babylon was the Rome of its day. It was the city of Hammurabi, the lawgiver. It was a center of science, astronomy, and immense wealth, protected by the most famous dynasty in history. It was considered untouchable. The idea that a group of mountain warriors could march across the known world and threaten the gates of Babylon was laughable until they arrived. The Hittites struck with shocking speed. They didn't besiege the city for months. They stormed it. They smashed through the defenses, poured into the streets, and brought the glorious dynasty of Hammurabi to a violent, bloody end. They torched the temples, looted the treasury, and seized the golden statues of the Babylonian gods. It was a raid of unprecedented scale. It sent a shockwave through the ancient Near East. Suddenly, every king from Egypt to Assyria had to look at a map and realize that nowhere was safe. If the Hittites could reach Babylon, they could reach anyone. But this victory brought with it a dark lesson that would haunt the Hittites for centuries. Mursili had conquered the world, but he had left his back exposed. As the army marched the long road home, laden with gold and glory, knives were being sharpened in the capital. Mursili returned to Hattusa, not to a hero's welcome, but to a conspiracy. His own brother-in-law assassinated him, plunging the empire into chaos. The sack of Babylon proved the Hittites were a superpower, but the murder of their king proved that their most dangerous enemies were not in Babylon. They were in the palace. After the assassination of Mursili, the empire could have easily dissolved in the civil war and obscurity, but the Hittites possessed something that their neighbors did not. They had a technological edge that would define warfare for the next millennium. History often remembers the Hittites as the Lords of Iron for decades. Scholars believe they were the first people to discover how to smelt iron, or giving them invulnerable weapons, while the rest of the world fought with soft bronze. The reality is more nuanced, but no less terrifying. While they didn't have mass-produced steel factories, the Hittites controlled the rich iron deposits of the Anatolian mountains. In a world where bronze swords a mixture of copper and tin would bend or dull after a heavy strike, a dagger of iron was a weapon of mass destruction. It was the nuclear technology of the Bronze Age. The Hittite kings guarded this secret jealously, gifting iron goods only to their closest allies while hoarding the technology for themselves. But their true military genius wasn't in their swords. It was in their vehicles. The tank of the ancient world was the chariot, but not all chariots were created equal. The Egyptians, famous for their speed, built chariots that were like sports cars. They were lightweight, made of bent wood and leather, and carried 2 men, a driver and an archer. Their strategy was to stay at a distance, firing arrows into the enemy ranks, using speed to avoid capture. The Hittites looked at this design and laughed. They didn't want a sports car, they wanted a Humvee. They engineered a heavy assault chariot. They moved the axle to the middle of the cart to support more weight. They reinforced the wheels with iron tires. And most importantly, they widened the cab to hold 3 men, not 2. This third man changed everything. He wasn't a driver, and he wasn't an archer. He was a shield bearer or a spearman. This allowed the Hittite chariot to do something the Egyptians never dared. They could crash directly into infantry lines. They didn't skirt the edges of the battle. They smashed through the center. It was shock warfare. A wall of heavy Hittite chariots charging at full speed would shatter enemy formations, crushing soldiers under hooves and wheels while the spearmen stabbed down at the survivors. With the secret of iron in their forges and the heavy chariot on the battlefield, the Hittites stabilized their chaotic empire. They were no longer just a kingdom of raiders. They were a military superpower, fully equipped and waiting for a reason to test their new weapons against the only other giant left on the board, Egypt. In 1323 BC, the ancient world held its breath. The most famous pharaoh in history King Tutankhamun died unexpectedly at the age of 19. He left behind a country in shock, a power vacuum, and a terrified young widow named Enki. In the cutthroat world of the Egyptian court, a widow without a son was vulnerable. Enki Cinnamon was being pressured to marry an elderly advisor named Ayaman she likely considered a servant. Desperate to escape this fate, she did something that was considered high treason. She wrote a letter, but she didn't write to an Egyptian ally. She wrote to the enemy. She sent a secret message to the Hittite king, Suppiluliuma. The text of this letter has survived on a clay tablet found in the ruins of Hattusa. It is one of the most desperate pleas in history. She wrote, "My husband is dead and I have no son. They say you have many sons. You might give me one of your sons to become my husband. I would not wish to take one of my subjects as a husband. I am afraid." When the Hittite king read this, he was stunned. For centuries, Egypt and Hatti had been bitter rivals. Now, the Queen of Egypt was offering to marry a Hittite prince. It would unite the two superpowers into a single, unstoppable empire. It was an alliance that would rule the world. Suspicious but intrigued, Suppiluliuma sent an envoy to confirm the offer. When the envoy returned with confirmation, the king made his move. He selected his son, Prince Zaneza, and sent himself to marry the queen and become the pharaoh of Egypt. But the prince never arrived. As the Hittite party crossed the border into Egyptian territory, they were ambushed. Prince Ananza was murdered, likely by agents of the very man the queen was trying to avoid marrying. The alliance died with him. When the news reached Hattusa, King Suppiluliuma was consumed by grief and rage. He declared total war on Egypt. His armies smashed through Egyptian vassal states in the Levant, burning cities and taking thousands of prisoners back to the Hittite capital. But those prisoners carried something far deadlier than weapons. They carried an invisible assassin. As the prisoners were marched into the heart of the Hittite Empire, they brought with them a plague, possibly smallpox or two. The disease exploded in the crowded streets of Hattusa. It didn't care about rank or nobility. It killed the soldiers. It killed the farmers. And finally, it killed King Suppiluliuma himself. The widow's letter was meant to save a queen. Instead, it triggered a biological apocalypse that decimated the Hittite population for 20 years, leaving the empire hollowed out and gasping for survival. The year is 1274 BC. The plague has passed. The empires have rebuilt. And now, the two greatest powers of the Bronze Age are on a collision course. A new pharaoh sits on the throne of Egypt, Ramses II, known to history as Ramses the Great. He is young, arrogant, and hungry for glory. Opposite him is the Hittite king Muwatalli II, a seasoned strategist who is determined to keep the Egyptians out of his backyard. They met at the city of Kadesh in modern-day Syria. It was a setting for the largest chariot battle in human history. Historians estimate that 5,000 chariots and over 50,000 soldiers converged on this single dusty plain. Ramses arrived first. Trusting false intelligence from captured spies, he believed the Hittite army was terrified and had retreated far to the north. Confident in his easy victory, Ramses set up camp with only one of his 4 army divisions. He left the rest of his troops miles behind, marching slowly up the road. It was a fatal mistake. The Hittites hadn't retreated. They were hiding. King Muwatalli had concealed his entire army behind the mound of the city of Kadesh. He was watching Ramses walk into the trap. As soon as the Egyptians began to unpack their tents, the trap was sprung. 2,500 heavy Hittite chariots roared across the Orontes River. They didn't attack Ramses directly, smashed into the Egyptian division that was still marching to the camp. It was a massacre. The heavy Hittite chariots hit the unsuspecting Egyptians like a freight train, scattering the division and sending panic rippling through the ranks. Suddenly, Ramses found himself cut off and surrounded. The Hittite chariots wheeled around and crashed into the pharaoh's camp. According to Egyptian records, what happened next was a miracle. Ramses claims that, abandoned by his cowardly soldiers, he called upon the god Amen and fought off thousands of Hittites single-handedly. He claims he was a whirlwind of destruction, crushing the enemy beneath his wheels. The reality was likely less supernatural. The Hittite soldiers, believing they had already won, stopped to loot the Egyptian camp. This greed bought Ramses just enough time for his reinforcements to arrive and save him from execution. The battle ended in a bloody, exhausting stalemate, but the aftermath was a masterclass in ancient politics. Both sides went home and claimed they had won a crushing victory. Ramses covered the walls of his temples with carvings of his triumph. The Hittites wrote tablets boasting that the Egyptians had been humiliated. It was the first time in history that two superpowers fought a war not just with weapons, but with propaganda. It is easy to look at the Hittites and see only a war machine. We see the iron swords, the heavy chariots, and the burning cities. But if you strip away the armor, you find something surprisingly human underneath. Just outside the capital city of Hattusa, hidden among the limestone peaks, lies a sanctuary called Yap. It is an open-air temple where the Hittites worshipped. Carved into the sheer rock walls are long lines of gods marching in procession. There are storm gods, sun goddesses, mountain gods, and gods borrowed from the lands they conquered. They didn't call themselves the Iron Empire. They called themselves the City of 1,000 Gods. This wasn't just a poetic name, it was a political strategy. Unlike other ancient empires that forced their religion upon the people they conquered, the Hittites did the opposite. When they defeated a city, they didn't smash its idols. They kidnapped them, they brought the foreign gods back to Hattusa, and added them to the pantry. They believed that if they honored every god in the world, no god could ever be angry with them. It was a civilization built on a kind of paranoid tolerance. But this tolerance extended beyond religion. It permeated their laws. In the ancient world, justice was usually brutal. The Code of Hammurabi in Babylon and the laws of the Old Testament often followed the principle of lex talionis. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. If you broke a man's arm, your arm was broken. If you killed, you were killed. The Hittites were different. Their laws were based on restitution, not retribution. If you blinded a free man in a fight, the Hittite law said you did not lose your eyes. Instead, you had to pay him 20 shekels of silver. You had to cover his medical bills and compensate him for his lost work. They treated crime as a debt that needed to be paid rather than a sin that needed to be punished with blood. They were administrators, diplomats, and bureaucrats. They kept detailed treaties, wrote history books, and managed a complex federal system that gave rights to women and slaves that would not be seen again for centuries. Walking through the streets of Hattusa in 1250 BC, you would not have felt like you were in a barbarian outpost. You would have seen a thriving metropolis, huge grain silos, libraries full of clay tablets, and a people who believed their system was just, their gods were happy, and their empire was eternal. They had no idea that they were living in the twilight of their civilization. The gods they collected so carefully were about to go silent. In the year 1200 BC, the Hittite Empire was still a superpower. They had peace treaties with Egypt, they controlled the trade routes, and their king Suppiluliuma II commanded a massive army. The world seemed stable. The world seemed permanent. 20 years later, they were gone. Historians call it the Bronze Age collapse. It is the greatest disaster in the history of civilization, worse than the fall of Rome. Around 1177 BC, the entire civilized world of the Eastern Mediterranean suddenly unraveled. It wasn't just the Hittites. The Mycenaean Greeks vanished, the kingdom of Ugarit was destroyed, and Egypt barely survived. For decades, we thought it was just a war. But modern science has revealed a terrifying truth. It was a perfect storm. Climate data from ancient tree rings shows that a megadrought hit the region. For centuries, the rains had been reliable. Suddenly, they stopped. The wheat withered in the fields of Anatolia. Famine gripped the land. In a desperate attempt to feed his people, the Hittite king sent urgent letters to Egypt demanding grain shipments just to survive. But then, the trade routes went silent. From the west, a mysterious confederation of raiders appeared on the horizon. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples. We still don't know exactly who they were, perhaps refugees from Europe or pirates from the Aegean, but they were unstoppable. They swarmed down the coast like locusts, burning every city in their path. They cut the lifelines of the global economy. When the end finally came for Hattusa, it was strange. Archaeologists excavating the Hittite capital expected to find a massacre. They expected to find bodies in the streets, skeletons with arrowheads in their spines, the signs of a desperate last stand. Instead, they found ... emptiness. The royal palace had been burned to the ground. Yes, the temples were smashed, but there were no gold statues. The royal archives were tidy. The evidence suggests a chilling conclusion. The Hittites knew the end was coming. They didn't fight to the death. The government, The royal family and the army packed up everything of value and evacuated the city before the enemy arrived. They abandoned their fortress. The greatest capital of the north was left as a hollow shell. When the invaders, the sea peoples, or perhaps local enemies, finally breached the gates, there was no one left to kill. They torched the empty buildings, melting the mud bricks into red glass with the intensity of the heat. The Hittite people scattered into the mountains, devolving into small, insignificant city-states. The central government was gone. The line of kings was broken. And within a few generations, the language of Hatti, the laws, and the history were forgotten. The silence had begun. For 3,000 years, the Hittites were nothing more than a footnote in the Bible. They appeared in a few verses of the Old Testament Uriah, the Hittite, or the tribes that sold land to Abraham. But based on these brief mentions, the world assumed they were just a small, insignificant tribe of hill people living in Canaan. No one suspected that they had once ruled the world. The Greeks didn't know them. The Romans had forgotten them. To the travelers of the 19th century, the ruins of Hattusa were just Tyria, a mysterious pile of rocks that didn't fit into the known timeline of history. It wasn't until 1906 that the silence was finally broken. A German archaeologist named Hugo Winkler arrived in the dusty Turkish village of Bogas. He began to dig. He wasn't looking for gold. He was looking for clay, and he found it. Winkler uncovered a royal archive of over 10,000 clay tablets. They were hardened by the very fire that had destroyed the city 3 millennia earlier. But there was a problem. No one could read them. The script was cuneiform, borrowed from Babylon, but the language itself was an unknown code. For a decade, the tablets sat in museums, silent and indecipherable. Then, in 1915, a Czech linguist named Bedřich Rosner made a breakthrough that shook the foundations of history. He was staring at a sentence about bread and water. He read the word for water, water. He read the word for Edie. He realized with a shock that he wasn't looking at a Middle Eastern language like Hebrew or Arabic. He was looking at an Indo-European language. The Hittites were speaking a language related to Greek, Latin, German, and English. Water was water. Ison was eat. Suddenly, these alien people with their strange iron weapons and jagged fortress walls felt familiar. They were our linguistic cousins. We were listening to the voices of our own ancestors, speaking to us from the Bronze Age through these tablets. The Hittites finally told their own story. We found their laws, their prayers, their letters to Egyptian queens, and their treaties. We realized that the insignificant tribe of the Bible was actually the third superpower of the ancient world. They had been hiding in plain sight, buried under the dust of Turkey, waiting for us to find them. Today, the Hittites serve as a humbling reminder. We look at our own civilization, our skyscrapers, our treaties, our vast armies, and we assume we are permanent. The Hittites thought so too, but history proves that even the masters of iron can rust away. The Hittites collapsed during the Bronze Age apocalypse, a mysterious event that destroyed almost every civilization in the region within a single lifetime. But the question remains, who exactly pulled the trigger? We mentioned the sea peoples, the mysterious invaders who burned the coastlines and vanished as quickly as they appeared. Were they Vikings of the south? Were they refugees fleeing a climate catastrophe? Or were they a Texivi confederation of pirates? If you want to uncover the ancient world's greatest stories, subscribe this channel.